I already have recording privileges. That is pretty cool. Cool. So over here I have the lecture, and I'm going to switch back regularly to this screen here. This screen here, I just have, an index.html. Can I take that little mini map off? I never like seeing that. Whatever. We have our HTML page here. If you look in here, there's an index.js next to it. So I just have that open right over here. It doesn't have anything in it yet. But we're, likely going to use that. And then I'm using live server so you could see it right here. So if I were to make a change like saying hello Q and save that, it would show up. And we're not going to focus too much on the CSS today because while the CSS is necessary to make a website look nice and professional, for demonstrating the usefulness of JavaScript within the browser, doesn't really matter what it looks like. You just want to see that we're adding functionality. Cool. So yeah, what are the topics we're covering today? The first thing is that we're going to introduce the DOM, at least more formally than we have before, which stands for the Document Object Model. We'll get into that. And then we're going to understand how to use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. And then finally, how to handle events in the browser and what those are. So up until this point, we have learned some JavaScript, but we've been doing it in Node. And Node is an environment that lives on your own computer, can interact with a file system and stuff. And you're writing JavaScript, but you're writing JavaScript to do a lot of the things that you might use Python to do on your computer, like to read a file or to make a little command line interface, or just to, write a program that, given some input, produces some output. Now we're going to talk about JavaScript in its original environment. So Node was kind of a later invention when people said, hey, maybe JavaScript is for other things. But by default, JavaScript was a browser thing. And that looks like this, where I have, my browser, which is showing me a page. But if I hit F12, I can see this dev console, which always has a lot in it. Sometimes it seems like too much. And this dev console shows me first the DOM. So as you see here, this is, we don't think of it as an object, but when it was HTML, it was just like, text. But at this point, I have this structure in which it's aware, okay, well, body is nested within head, and H1 is nested within body. And that has a kind of tree-like structure to it. And sure enough, if we go to console, this is where we have access to JavaScript. And I could write something like console.log hello. So that should, print hello to this very same console. The reason we see two things there is that it's printing hello, but then returning undefined, because that's what gets returned when we evaluate console.log anything. But because this is a REPL-like environment, we can just write hello and we just see it, it evaluates to itself. So this environment runs JavaScript, but unlike in Node, we have access to certain things that have to do with this environment. So JavaScript is relatively unique among programming languages in that, unlike Python, or unlike most languages, which simply the language works a certain way, the language is a standard, JavaScript is always running in an environment. And what that means is that JavaScript runs in a context that gives it some things for free. So when we were in Node world, let's make this a lot bigger so you can see it. But when we were in Node world, if I type Node, I might have some things in there like this thing called global. Might not seem important, but it has some things I might care about that are built in to Node. And then of course, Node has the ability to import certain things, like to mess with the file system, because it's aware its environment is a file system, is a computer in general. JavaScript in the browser is a little different because it doesn't necessarily, let me get out of that. It doesn't believe it's in a file system. It believes it's in a browser. And that means you're going to have certain special keywords built into this browser environment. So one of them is window. And window represents this whole window that the tab represents. And, there's going to be a lot of things in here. So I could say window.alert, and that is going to give me some power that I did not have without it. So I could say window.alert hello, and I hit enter, and a little pop-up comes up telling me hello, and I can click OK. And that's just sort of like the built-in API of the browser that JavaScript can interact with. The next most important thing after window is this thing called document. Always forget. Document represents our entire HTML document, but it represents it as an object. So you see, they're making it nice for me where I can click it and open it, but basically this is an object. And the way you know it's an object is because you could say document dot, and then it's going to have lots of fields and methods that you can mess with. So there's a lot of them, and some end up being more useful than others. I wonder if there's like a, I just wonder, like, what is document.fonts is going to tell me some stuff about the font I'm currently using, I guess. And yeah, so this is basically an object. It's a key value pairs that we can hold the information that represents the page. And part of it being an object is that it might contain, as part of its key value pairs, some of the values will be objects themselves. And in this way, we can represent the entirety of the document and everything that's in it. So I guess I could just say document.body, and that's going to represent just the body, right? And then I could say document.body. What is, how do I see what's inside? Is inner, can I say inner HTML? Yes, I can say get me, or just maybe get me the text. I just want the text that's within the body, all the text, and that would be all the text. So yeah, and right, so we have fields and methods that document supports to mess with the document, and that's essentially what the DOM is. We could see it more visually here. It really is a tree, as in the document contains, this root element HTML, which contains two elements, head and body. Each one of those might contain elements. Some elements are just self-contained. Some have text inside of them. But elements can always contain more elements. And so it's like a tree with this, this branching structure, and the leaves would be whatever is completely, at the bottom level. So like this H1 here, it has no children, but it's the child of something, which is the child of something, which is in some sense the child of just the document as a whole. So yeah, that's the tree-like structure. And before moving on, let's just ask, like, how does the DOM make sense as a concept? I hate asking questions like that, because what are you going to say? No, like, I don't know. I don't necessarily get great feedback when I ask a question like that, but how do we feel about this phrase, DOM, document object model? Does it make sense? Are we concerned?
The elements are objects, right?
The elements are objects. Yeah, exactly. So when we look at the HTML page as an HTML page, we could say that each one of these maybe represents an element, right? But that's just how we're thinking about it in HTML. Whereas once we're in the JavaScript world, everything is essentially an object. So if I am curious, if I wrote type of document, yeah, it's an object. And then if I wrote type of document dot body, it's still an object, right? Exactly. So it's an object all the way down. Then just out of curiosity, we haven't gone into this yet, but the most powerful thing you can do with the document is look up certain elements, because then you can do something with them. And we do that with these various things like query selector or query selector all. So I could say query selector, And what is my query? So just like CSS selectors, I'm going to say, I just want H1. And because I wrote query selector and not query selectors or whatever the other version is, instead of getting a list, we get a specific thing. So right, so I'm getting this specific thing H1 and it's still an object. And if I were to take out that type of, so you could see it, it literally is, you know, an object that represents this single H1 with some text in it. So again, if I were to save that, let's say I'm just going to call that elem for now. If I were now to look into elem, I would see that, okay, well, if I just, you know, hit elem, it's going to show me that H1, but that's just it knowing how to print itself. But if I hit elem dot, I see, oh, I have so much things I could do on that element because every element is going to contain lots and lots of values that allow you to change, you know, some quality about it. So I'm not familiar with most of these, but like children would be a classic one. Children is going to tell me all the children it has, in this case, none. What else might we have here? So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I could say append. So I'm appending to this child. And what am I appending? Basically another HTML element. So I wonder where it's going to put it on the page if I do this, but I'm taking that H1 element and I'm adding, just like in Python, we, you know, append to the end of a list. So I'm appending to the end, I believe, of this element. And so I do that and okay, that was a little weird, not quite what I expected. But basically I was able to append something to the end of this list because you know, this is my H1 and now my H1 has something inside of it or something new inside of it. Didn't do it quite right, but that's the core of the DOM being something that has fields and methods, and you can manipulate it to change what your page looks like. All right, so we're going to copy paste this HTML just to see it in action. All right, what do we have here? So I'll close this for right now. What we have here, first of all, is some HTML. So before even reading this top part in the head, we're going to look at our body and say, okay, well, we have this, you know, input element, which we're giving an ID of input name and a placeholder of name. So that's that little placeholder there. And then right below it, a button with a submit on it, and then an on-click attribute on the button, and that on-click attribute actually calls a function that we define in JavaScript, but let's forget that we defined it for a second. And then below we have this div, and this div is a paragraph with another ID on it, output. And you might be asking why we have these IDs, because you know we don't have any CSS. So what is the point of these IDs? Well, just like CSS uses selectors, JavaScript can use selectors to say, I'm looking for a specific type of element, or I'm looking for all elements that have this class or something like that. And so that's why we have these here, because we're going to be able to use them in our JavaScript. And how does that actually happen? When the page is rendered, it goes top to bottom, and everything in head is going to happen first. And we have this script in head. So the idea is this script is going to run before anything in the body runs. But when the script runs, in this case, our script just contains a function. So basically, we're going to define this function. And then by the time we're rendering the body, that function is now available by name because it's defined at the top level. But we haven't run any code. Though notably, I would say that we're going to get into some of the details of this, but if I write console.log hello here, you'll see that indeed, if I go to the console, it already printed hello. And importantly, it printed hello before the body even existed. So as you see here, we have something called document.getElementById input name. And that is going to do what it says. So when we look at this function, what this function does is we call show greeting, and we do that through an on click here. And when we call show greeting, what happens is first we're gonna, I mean, I don't think these should be lets but const, but it doesn't really matter. But we're going to create two variables, one name input, one greeting input, and name input is going to take the document, call this function get element by ID, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. And it's going to look in the document for the first thing it finds with an ID equal to input dash name. And if it gets it, it's going to store it in name input. And as you see here, name input knows it's going to be an HTML element, which is just an object, but still it's a type of object called an HTML element. And of course it could also not get this. So we see we have this function here. I hit submit and that function runs. I'll take that out for now. Maybe the proof of that is that, first thing I do is say console.log, we are running this. And indeed, if I click submit, we see we are running this. And then here I have that name input. So again, I could console.log name input to see that I am getting some output. And then I hit submit. And then you see the input is just here. It did grab something. So just to show you what would happen if I just made up a name, something that's not in there. I'll do it again. Okay, no. So in HTML, if you try and query for an HTML element, you will either get back that element or you'll get back null saying we didn't find anything matching that selector. So this, we printed out our name input, printed out our, or grabbed rather our greeting input. Both of these we're just holding onto those elements. And then in here I say, as long as I grabbed an input and grabbed a greeting output, because I want those to both be not null because I care what's inside of them, then I'll say, okay, the greeting output has this field called inner HTML, which we could show in here that if I were to write something like this, so if I'm setting greeting output to be that given element, then I could write greeting output and I'll see that it is this element. But if I were to write greeting output dot inner HTML, well, it has that field by default, but that field is just an empty string because it doesn't actually have any inner HTML. There's nothing inside of that p tag. But that doesn't mean we can't set it to something. So just like that, I could say, okay, well, I have the element. So now I'm going to take its inner HTML and I can modify that. I can make it say whatever I want. And now it appears on the page. So what we're going to do in this function is we say, as long as we have a name input and a greeting input, we are going to grab the inner HTML from the greeting input so we can set it to something new. And we'll set it to hello plus, and then an exclamation. But then what we're going to write is hello name input dot value. So name input, just like greeting output, is another HTML element. So I can write name input, and you'll see it's just that. It's a representation of that specific element. And that element will have its own stuff on it. So they're not, certain things are going to be on every HTML element, like inner text, inner HTML, because by the nature of being an HTML element, they automatically have those. But some are going to have some unique things, like if it's an input, it's going to have something on it called value. And so value is going to represent what the current value of it is, but it's empty right now. Now I just put something in there. So now if I look at it, it knows what it is. So what this means in total is that what this function is going to do is it's going to take that name input and that greeting output, or knowing that they exist, it's going to set the greeting outputs in our HTML to be hello, whatever the current name input dot value is, plus exclamation. So just going to run it again, and I'll say Benjamin Cohen. And maybe because I didn't save it, something's not going right. But if I write Ben, right, it now says hello, Ben. We don't need we are running this anymore. If I just hit submit, what happens? Well, it actually still works because both of those elements exist, and we didn't say anything along the lines of like, we don't print this unless name input has an actual value. So I would personally probably change this where I would say, okay, we need these two things, but while it's necessary that I have a greeting output, I mean, honestly, if I were to rewrite this, I would write something like, maybe this isn't going to be a worthwhile function unless I have both of those things. I might say if it's not the case that name input, or it's not the case the greeting output. So if either of these are null, then I just want to return. You could always return early. And then if I'm not returning early, then I'm going to do something. And what am I going to do? Well, again, I might want to say like, this is also kind of a meaningless function unless name input not just exists, but has something in its value that's not empty. So I'll say also return early if name input does exist. We would only get this far if this wasn't null and this wasn't null, but I'm saying if name input's value, because it's a string, I could just say if name inputs value dot length, I'm pretty sure I can do this, is greater than 0. Well, I want to return early if it is 0. Otherwise, and this is by the way, this is a new thing, but this doesn't look like 3 triple equals, but it is. It's just a little, little editor thing that makes it look a little nicer. But in any of these cases, I'm going to want to just return early. Otherwise, I can guarantee I have all of it. So I'm going to write something. And how is this going to work now? The main difference now is that if I type all this, or if I have nothing in there and I hit submit, it's not going to do anything. And maybe instead of just returning, if I wanted to be really pedantic, I could open this up, and before the return, maybe say something like alert, because alert is one of those built-in things for the browser. And I'll say input is empty. And in a real app, you probably wouldn't write input. You wouldn't have an alert. You would probably have something that like highlights that element to say there's a problem there. But just to show, if I just click submit here, okay, input is empty, not so good. But if not, I'll actually add that thing to the HTML. So I type some stuff and now it works. Cool. And honestly, even if I wanted to just stay on here, you would see how you sort of like iteratively start like improving things. So I can look at this and say like, okay, this works, but it would be kind of nice if I blanked out what the input held after successfully doing something. So I might come back here and say like, I want to make this that. So I might come back here and say, okay, in any one of these cases, I alert, and then I say return. And then in this case, I'll do this. And then maybe right after I'll take whatever that name input is, and I'll take its value. And because I already read its value, and now I want to blank it out to say, hey, we successfully submitted. Now it's empty. So now if I type something in there, I hit submit, it says hello, but then it goes back to its empty state. And again, if I wanted to get even more, like the real way to do this would maybe be like, maybe instead of checking for this like this, I would have, if there is no name or greeting output, instead of an alert, maybe I'll throw something. I'll throw, we got a problem exception. So we're not going to see that functionality because those are both here. But I might say, okay, well, that's the case where the things don't even exist. But let's say we're in that case where name inputs value was empty, and I want to say, well, that's not good. You actually want to, we want to force you to add something there. So maybe I would have, here I have this P with the output, but maybe right below that P, I would have just another key that's going to start out empty, and it's going to have an ID equal to error. And then I'll have nothing in it initially, but maybe I would want to give it a style by default. So you can write CSS kind of inline if you want to. And the way I'm going to do that is I'll write style and then color red. And I believe that should work. So maybe something I could say is, okay, if name input dot value dot length is 0, then I also want access to this error. So I'll add that up here. So we have another thing by ID called error. And then at this point, I would say error dot inner text equals can't submit empty string. And now we would try that if I just try hitting submit. It still says that hello stuff. So right, we probably want to return early, so it doesn't do that. Submit, okay, can't submit empty string. And if I write some stuff, okay, it wrote this, but we're still seeing can't submit empty string. So it's sort of like every time we hit submit, we probably want to first clear out that error's inner text, regardless of what the current, So you could see how it's sort of like, this is a very low level way of doing things, and we eventually see a better way of doing things, but you can sort of incrementally change the behavior in this way where you say add or remove things from the page based on, so now we're going to say can't submit empty string, but notably, if I hit it again, we just see it once. If I were to take this out, I could hit it. Oh, interesting. Right, because we're just setting the inner text. But importantly, the way we're doing this, we see the error, but if I type stuff, the next time we don't see the error because first we're clearing it out. And then the next cool thing I might want to do is take that actual input box. So that element is called input name, or that's how we're grabbing it. So we have this named input thing. My question now is, okay, well, if we're in this situation where we can't submit an empty string, maybe I want to highlight that. So is there a way that I could go into this element and highlight it? And this is where you start just kind of write or you experiment with CSS, where I'm going to look at this and say, well, how do I change like the border color? Is that what I want? Or like if I were to say border 2 pixel red solid. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know that that's the best version of like, oh, this is a bad, you got to fix this, but that seems to be my answer, that I want to change the border. So when I'm here, I can say name input dot, I don't think I can directly get the border, so I can say style, right? And that's going to let me get all the CSS. And then from there, I could say, grab my border and make it equal to 2 pixel red solid. So that should work now, where I hit submit, it doesn't work. It's telling me can't submit, and also it's highlighting it. And then once again, if I were to write something in it and hit submit, well, it's still red. I kind of don't love that. So I'm going to make sure that every time I recall this function, I'm going to initially change that. And actually these neither, or we probably want to first check, do these elements even exist? So what might I set my border to? Probably just an empty string, and then there is no border. So yeah, I can hit submit, red error, red highlight, and then I type some stuff in it, hit submit. Okay, it worked this time. Cool. So that's just to show you through an example, like how you might start getting functionality you care about just using these basic building blocks. So any question about what we've seen so far? It all seems pretty natural. Yeah, I mean, the basic new idea is just this document thing, and the wisdom is that document is just an object, and if you dig into that object, you'll find everything you can possibly care about that will let you alter your HTML page.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
So you have your JavaScript and like inside of this script on your HTML. Can you like import it like kind of like a CSS and have your script on you have your JavaScript on a different file? Because I don't really like I don't like how the JavaScript which is with the HTML.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is good insight, because the very next thing I believe our teaching document talks about is that very quickly we say, well, external JavaScript, like there's no reason it has to live here. We can use this script tag. So you are right. I'm going to grab everything that's in here. I'm going to take it out. I'm going to put it in this index.js. And then in here, I still have my script tag, but now I'm going to say source equals to, and it should understand where we are, right? So I'm going to just grab index.js. And now if I save it, should see the exact same behavior. Something to note though, let's say I go into this, like I'm running this in the head, right? So let's say I go into the index.js and I don't just define a function here, but I were to say like, well, in addition to defining this function, I also, for whatever reason, I want to immediately print out what document.getElementById has in it. So I'll run that. And if I look in console, you'll see that because like the minute this script tag is hit, it runs all that code. And that means that because it ran all that code, at the top level, show greeting exists. So if I run this, this will still work. But because it runs that code immediately, this line here wasn't just defining something, it was doing something. And it's trying to get an element by an ID for printing it. And you'll see that we see null here. So why do we see null there? We see null there because when this is ran, the body doesn't even exist yet. It hasn't gotten that far. So one solution would be to move it, where you say like, actually, I don't want it in the head. I want it at the very bottom of the body. And in that case, it now works as expected, where we're actually seeing that element in our console.log. But there is another solution that is probably more elegant, because it's kind of nice to put all of your resources in the head and the body just be the actual HTML that the DOM will represent. So what I can add in here are some special attributes. And normally an attribute, if an attribute is like source, you have that key and that value. But some attributes, their value would only be true or false. So as a result, we don't write, like in this case, we're trying to add defer. And I believe it would work if I said defer equals like true. Or if I said defer equals anything, it works, because all it's looking for is to say, well, is defer there at all? If defer is there, then change the behavior. If it's not, then you don't mean defer. So what defer is going to do is just, it's automatically going to move that script to the bottom of the body. And that's the main way that you solve the problem of like, wanting to have all your resources in the head, but wanting to make sure that that script isn't running until it's ready to run, i.e. when the entire document is already loaded. Cool, but yeah, that's the main way we would do things in general. We would include a script. And even though we only have one script right now, if we had more than one, we could do that. We just add it below and they run in the order you see them. Okay, so as you see, it's the exact same functionality. And we're using this defer keyword. So the next thing is just to show you that we have all these different possible functions. There's get element by ID, get elements by class name. So you'll see how by default an ID, it expects there's only one of them. So get element by ID will look for the first thing with an ID that matches and then return. You're done. Whereas classes, they expect there might be more than one of a given class. So get elements by class name will return an array. Same with get elements by tag name. And then query selector is just a generalization that will let you write things as if you were writing CSS selectors, and query selector all will do the same thing, but for a list. So here's the example we're using to show that. I think we're just going to add this to the body. So if I go here, just underneath everything, I'll add some stuff to the body. And this is what it looks like right now. We have, this horizontal row, and then these two buttons, red and blue, which call something called update color. But update color doesn't exist yet, so it doesn't quite like that. And then I have these three divs, each with a different ID, but their classes are such that, two of them share alpha, and that's it, I guess. But we're going to use those to show these different behaviors. So I'm going to add some of this functionality in here. In index.js, we can define as much as we want. So now I'm going to define another function called update color. And as you see here, these onClicks expect to call update color, and they call it with a specific value. So update color is actually going to take an input we're going to call color, which is going to be a string. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, I'd rather call it elem. I don't really like single element or single character variables unless it's necessary or if it's a real throwaway thing. So document.getElementById should get me the first element with an ID equal to the string 1. And then once it does that, we're going to access the style on that element and access the color and set it to whatever this color we passed in was. So if I hit red here, it's going to update this first div because of get element by ID 1. So, the only thing with an ID of 1, or at least the first thing it saw, was this. Just to prove the point, I'll probably do that. Let me add an element at the end here. If I say div ID equals 1, this is the fourth div. There's nothing about HTML that's not going to let me do that. It's mostly like I can have two things with an ID. It's not going to blow up. But if I hit red here, it's only going to highlight that first one because this document.getElementById assumes there's only one, and so it's just going to return the first one it finds. By the same token, we have a few other similar things. So I can say, in this case, we're going to be using elems. So I'm going to replace this right here with this. Oh, and this one as well. Now I'm saying, okay, well, the way update color works is I'm going to get this. It's not really important that I change this stuff, but I want it to look how I would want it to look. So I'm going to say grab, I'm going to have this list of elements. So if we hover, we see it's not really a list or an array. It's rather an HTML collection of, which we'd have to dig in to see the difference. But I have these elements, and then I can say get elements by class name. If I look here, I see I have two elements. The first and the second both have alpha in it. And as long as it has that class name, doesn't have to, as you see here, like it can have more than that class name, but as long as it has that class name, elems should have a list, and then we should be able to walk through that list and give it that given color. So that seems to work. And just so we can see what it looks like, what actually happens when we run code like this. Okay, well, we have this thing called an element, an HTML collection, and then there's a 2 in there. And if I were to open this up, I see like it's not exactly an array, but it's array-like, and then it has a length, and it has a 0 and a 1th element. It also seems to have fields called 1 and 2 that I can directly access, and both of those simply contain the HTML element. And there's even this prototype here telling me, well, you know, because this is from before the class days, it inherits from HTML collection. And then I might be able to look in there and say, well, what is an HTML collection? Okay, well, it has, you know, these various fields in it. So it has something called item, which is a function, which I guess can be used to, you know, grab something by its index, and named item. I guess that's where the 1 and 2 come in, that those are, each one of those items is named something. But yeah, that's how we would use get element by class name. And I can keep going through these, but you probably see the point already. But yeah, just any questions on this so far, though we will also cover, you know, these other forms of grabbing elements. All right, it seems like people are pretty good with this. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward. The reason why we're teaching this stuff is because this is how JavaScript interacts with the DOM at the most basic level that is given to you for free. This is sometimes called vanilla JavaScript. It's only so powerful, and you probably can see the limits of it already, in that you have to be very explicit about adding something to the page, and then if you add something to the page, making sure like, well, the next time that function is run, we want to blank out various things. And it's very much an imperative approach to manipulating this object, the DOM that represents the page. And hopefully the experience you have today working with it will teach you why it's useful, but also some of its shortcomings, which sets the stage for when we eventually talk about React, because React is a modern solution to manipulating what the page looks like in real time. That is a very different approach than this, but because it is a very different approach in order to address some of the like core issues with doing things in this way. But I mean, I don't even know that I need to show this. You understand what this will do is, in this will get all the elements with a given tag name, so it would match. Sorry, looking through our HTML, it would match every div. So it would match in the body would match this div and this div and all of these divs. So maybe let's see it just to see it. That if we're actually going to change elements to this. Okay, we're going to get everything with the tag name div, and for each one, we're going to change its color to color. So can anyone predict how many things on this page are going to turn red now? What do we expect is going to turn red based on what we see here? So when I click this
every
button,
div.
Yeah, so we have this div, and this div has 2 P's in it. Well, that change to color is going to propagate, assuming something else doesn't overwrite it. So both the output and I guess this error thing, if they existed, would have color red. And then each one of these would also have color red. So if I just hit red, yeah, they all turn red. But also notably, if I type a bunch, it's red, because every element, I mean, I'm surprised. Yeah, I guess the color was set to red, even though there was nothing in there yet. And now there is something in there. But if we look at that again, if I just write stuff and then I hit submit, it's not red by default. And now I'll say blue, they all turn blue because it matches everything on the page. That is a div. And finally, we have a query selector. This is the one you're going to see most commonly. So query selector can take a query, in that just like over here, I was able to say get element by ID 1. In this case, I could just say query selector #1. And if you know the rules of CSS, where hash means ID and dot means class, the idea is now anything that you could select with a query like you did with CSS you can select the elements you care about with query selector. And query selector has its complement, which is query selector all, which will do the same thing, but instead of giving you just one, it'll give you a list. So let me actually try that out. Over here, remember I made that second ID equal to 1. Well, if I go in here now and I say something like, I forgot how much I copied, but if I write something like this, okay, so I'm saying I have this const elms equals query selector all, and then I want to say ID of 1. I think it's going to get both of them because let's see. Yeah, it got both of them because there's nothing about HTML that actually enforces this idea that an ID is going to be unique. Rather, it's just a functionality that assumes an ID, assumes that there is only one. But this works perfectly fine if I want to do it this way. The better way would obviously be to make it a class, because we should be following this rule of only a single element on the page at any given time has a given ID. But there's a point there about how some rules in programming are like enforced and some aren't. And so this ID business about there only being one on the page, it's just sort of a soft recommendation, but you can violate it and things will work fine. Yeah, it's just not preferred, because if you did document.getElementById, that assumes you have one. Cool, but that's all of our basic query selecting stuff, and that's how we, given the document, get a specific element or set of elements. So any questions about this part, just, querying?
Just really quick. So let's say we decide to follow the actual like the right way. We have all the different IDs, but it's all like in paragraph div -1 -2 -3. Can we use wildcard selectors as well inside of the get selector by ID and field in order to get like a specific kind of div that we have IDs for?
Well, explain to me your situation. So you're saying we have different IDs on all of these, right?
Yeah, let's say we have a bunch of different divs with paragraphs all throughout a page, but it's only one section of divs that we want because maybe our CSS is styling them all one way. But their IDs are listed such that it's div -ID -1 2 3 4 for them. Could we use something like div -ID and then a star? Will JavaScript see that star and say, oh, it's a wildcard, anything that has the previously mentioned ID with anything after it?
Well, I would say I'm not sure that we can use getElementById for it, or that we'll use a wildcard exactly like you're saying. But it's a good question in terms of, is it possible? So let's understand what you're saying exactly. What is the ID that we're going to want to mess with a wildcard with, or what's an example of something that, like, what should I give this ID if I want?
Yeah, instead of those div IDs, just in front of it, put like div dash. So div ID equals div -1, div -2, div -3.
Yeah. So how about I'm going to do this? I'm going to do it for 2, 3, and 4. And the idea is we only want to match 2, 3, and 4, right?
Or 1, 2, and 4.
We only want to match div 1, div 2, and div 4. We don't want to match 3. We only want to match things that start with div/, right?
Yep.
Okay. So we're over here right now, and we already have query selector all. So the question is, what do we want to put in query selector all? Well, I don't know that, like, I in my mind, I'm pretty sure what the right way to do is, first we're going to look at selectors. Might have to write CSS selectors because that's generally what they're called. And then we're going to look at the reference. And I think the one we want here is a relatively complex one, but we're not in a position to say hash ID. And the problem with saying stars will get all the elements. So what we want to do is one of these attribute value pairs. So what we want to do is say, okay, well, my selector is actually like this. It's an attribute. It's anything with an ID, right? And what does that ID equal? Well, it equals a value, right? And then in this case, I would say that value is, div/, but not quite right. Because if I said my ID was div/1, I'm pretty sure this now works that if I say red or blue, it'll get that 1, right? But how do we get anything that starts with div? I think we want one of these slightly more complex ones. So yeah, basically we have a few options. One of them is squiggly equal, which means as long as it contains that word. This one means either it's going to be equal to or start with n/. Interesting. That's exactly the one we want. This one says it begins with that value. Exactly.
Okay, so that basically answers the question. Then I'll just read through the CSS selectors document then, because that. Okay, cool, awesome, thank you.
But I might as well. I mean, just to see it in action, it sounds like I want something like this. And what that means is as long as it starts with div or it starts with div/, it will match it. So let's see if that works. Blue, it works. That's pretty cool. But yeah, that's one of those things where like if I was reading someone's code and I saw this, I would say, oh, I've never seen that one. And then I would look it up and say, oh, okay, that's what that does. You don't see them super often because there's usually a better way, which is just like adding a class, adding a unique class. But stuff like this will work. So it's good to know that it exists at least. All right. Any other questions about querying? Just querying. So what we've covered so far is that the DOM exists and that when we want certain elements from the DOM, either a single element or multiple elements, there's always going to be some way of grabbing just the elements we care about. All right. Looks like there are no more questions. I guess you're all the experts. Why don't you all teach the class? Right. No.
I had a general question.
Okay.
About when you mentioned like you called it just vanilla JavaScript, and you mentioned React as well. I was just curious from your perspective, like what is one of the, I guess, biggest problems that React solves versus using just vanilla JavaScript?
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into that more once we cover React, because React is kind of a big concept. But when we say vanilla JavaScript, we just mean it's the stuff that's built in already. And what we're not including are libraries. So like vanilla JavaScript is all that existed very early on. And it's why really early successful apps like Gmail is made entirely in vanilla JavaScript. But the next level up from that would be something like jQuery. So jQuery is a library. Can show it here. jQuery is a library that was very popular for a while that basically lets you do everything vanilla JavaScript does, but in a way that is just more natural to work with. It gives you a lot of helper functions, very good like cross-browser compatibility, so you don't have to worry about how like, oh, Internet Explorer might work a little differently than Safari. That's less of a problem these days, but in the early 2000s, browsers were like just very different, and you would be writing the same website multiple times, and jQuery helped with that. But jQuery would count as not vanilla JavaScript, and this is how it works. We're basically just like saying this $sign basically means query selector. And so this is going to say get the thing with an ID of banner message. And then now we have this helper thing that says like, okay, well, get the thing with ID of button container and then get its button and then add a click event to it. And that event is called click. So this is the equivalent of like creating an on click on that element. And then here's the function that, runs when you click. So it's just like an easier way or a more natural way of writing JavaScript if that's all you have. But the idea is that jQuery is not vanilla JavaScript. And React is certainly not vanilla JavaScript. And when we say vanilla JavaScript, we just mean the fact that you can say document and you have that for free no matter what browser you're on. And you can say query selector and you have that for free by default. I don't know if there's anything. But yeah, that's all I mean by vanilla JavaScript. And kind of like with that jQuery stuff, even though we don't have jQuery by default, Chrome at least has something like it built in. So instead of having to write document.query selector, you can just write $. and that'll get you the first one. And then similarly, $$ will get you, will be query selector all. So that $ and $$ are nice little shortcuts, but you only have them when you're in that browser environment. You would not actually have them if you tried to if in here I tried to say $sign something, it doesn't know about it. So it's just a helpful browser thing. But yeah, that's what vanilla JavaScript is, and that's all we're talking about today. All right, cool. Well, I feel like we've been doing this for a little while. I don't know what the exact times were, but I want to give you guys, let's say, a 20-minute break. And then when we come back, it'll be 9:40, and then we'll just go to the end. Does that sound good? Great, 20-minute break. And I'll look at chat. Cool. I'll just look at the chat quickly. Okay, people be talking. I would say don't worry too much about React yet. We will get to it, but yeah, React gives you a lot of good things that make writing the visual layer of your app easier or nicer, more sustainable, and performance is one of those. We will get into that eventually, but it's kind of an advanced topic for right now. But React has ways of doing things more efficiently than you would otherwise be able to do with vanilla. Cool. So the last thing we covered were these ways of querying an element. You know, get elements by class name, get elements by tag name, query selector all. So that's how we grab specific elements. But one thing you might want to do when you grab a specific element is add something to it. So like the top level element is the document itself. And you could just add something to the end of the page that way, or you could grab a specific element and say, add something to right after it. So we're gonna write some of that logic here. So going back to our example here, you'll see I deleted everything, but one thing I did add is a link to a style sheet. So I have that style sheet here. So now we have, there's not much in the body, but everything we could care about is here. We have the HTML page, and we have some JavaScript running, and we have some CSS, and so we can make anything we want. So what I'm doing here is I'm first creating a button, and I'm giving it this onClick handler, which is going to call a function insert new element. So this is what it looks like right now. If you see, I'm going to get an error if I try and run it because that doesn't exist yet. So going back here, I'm going to grab this entire function and we'll take a look at it. So this function will make it so that when I click this element, something will happen. And what will happen? Well, first thing we're doing here is, I think these can both be const, we'll see. First thing we are doing is, well, I like to move these things right next to each other. So the first thing we'll do is grab two elements. And one of them is going to be this, or rather, one of them is a new element we're creating. So we're actually, instead of saying document.getElement by ID, we're just saying document.createElement div. And this creates a div, but it's not on the page yet. So if we were to run this code, we could say console.log new div. There wouldn't be much to it yet. But notably, if we don't do any of this other stuff, when we run this, we'll say insert new div, and we created this new div, but nothing's happened yet. But that's how you start by creating, that's how you create a new element to begin with, and then you could start modifying it. So here we created this new element called new div. It's a div, and then we have this thing called parent div, in which we looked in our file for something called parent div. So that doesn't exist yet either, as far as I know. So we have to first create that. We have our body here, and let's say after clicking, or sorry, we have our button here, and after clicking that button, we want to fill in a spot called parent div. So the idea is I'll have a div here, and it'll have an ID equal to parent div. And now we have something to actually grab onto. You don't see anything on the screen because that div has nothing in it. But if we were to look at all the elements, we would see, yes, there's a div called parent div currently taking up no space. So what else happens here? We grab that parent div because we're going to want it in a bit. And then we take that new div we're creating. And when we create that new div, we're going to give it some inner HTML. So just some text that lives inside of it, and a class name of alpha and added. So those are two different classes. And at this point, if I were to print what new div looked like, again, it doesn't live on the page yet. But if I did print it out, I would see that, okay, well, it doesn't just look like a blank div anymore. It's a div with some content in it and some classes. And then finally, I would say, if that parent div really existed, then we can append something to the child. And the way I might write this might be more like, first thing we do is even see if the parent div is there. And if it's not, we would return early. I like this approach of just returning early. And then I'll say only if the parent div does exist, do we even create this new div and start filling it in. And then at this point, we know the parent div exists. We don't have to check if it exists or not. And so we just add it to the page. And the way we do that is we take the parent div and we say append child. And that means I'm going to give it a child at the very end. And so let's see what it looks like now. I'll write insert div, and now we have something here. And if I were to inspect it, I would see that I have this parent div, and now it has a child. This is a newly created div. But notice, because of how we wrote it, every time I call this function, we're going to get that parent div, we're going to create a new div with this content, and then we're going to append it. There's nothing about replacing it. So the more times I click this, I'll just get more and more. I have no way of replacing it right now. Cool. And just to see how this works, and part of the reason why CSS works the way it does and is separate from the DOM on some level is that this has alpha and added. And we see that indeed, each one of these has classes alpha and added. And if I went into my style sheet and I said, well, actually, we have a class called alpha, and I want to make sure that everything with the class alpha has a color of green. So I'll save it, and then notice that if I refresh, well, there's nothing in there yet, but let's say I already had at least one div in here. And this, let me just make sure we are adding right. So we have divs in here. I'm going to have one div already in here already. And this div doesn't have any classes on it, so it just looks the way it does. Whereas all these new ones we're adding do have a class on it. And because of that class, they're automatically going to get the CSS that matches in the style sheet. So that is adding elements. And before we move on, how do we feel about adding elements to the page? Can you see why you would want to add elements to the page?
Could you go over that part where it actually appends it? Like you go into the JS really fast, because you do like really fast, and then so it just appends it like a regular way. So anytime you click that insert new div button, the parent div is just gonna add that line on, what is it, line 6?
Let's see, every time I click this, we're going to run this. And what happens when we run it is first we look up the parent div, which is this, and it might already have stuff in it. And assuming it exists, we then create a new div, which is not attached anywhere on the DOM yet. We give it these values. And then the final thing we do is we take that parent div and we call this function append child, which lets us add a child, meaning something internal to that div. So append child will mean look at the children. There's only one children right now, and then append to right after that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm actually not sure what the difference is if I write append here. Yeah, same difference. Inserts node after the last child of node, and what does append child do? But which is different. I think it's just it's the same thing as append. But there are other ways. Like I think if you wanted to add something next to it, that's possible. I don't insert after maybe. Yeah, so things like insert before. There are different ways of adding things at different points in the page. I wonder, so insert adjacent element. Oh, and you got to say where you're going to insert it. The most common approach is generally to grab a parent element and just add it as the last thing, but you ultimately have as much power as you want to mess with this stuff. So if I were to grab parent div here, I could say console.log. Oops. Parent div, and we'll see that every time I call it, it'll be a little different because this first time there was one thing in it. Second time there was more in it because of we added stuff. But I could just as well say like console.log parent div, and then what is in parent div, something like children. And what is children? It's an HTML collection. Like I'm pretty sure I can say, well, actually, every time you run this, get the third child. I mean, it's going to blow up initially because there will be no third child, but like I could just as well, assuming I had like a bunch of things here. Okay, so I have a bunch of things there already, and I will say that the functionality here is I'm going to say get, the third index, which would be the fourth child, and then that one is the one that I want to make equal to this new div. So I'm not, instead of appending it, I'm going to say just set that specific child to the new div. Oh, I deleted it. Excellent. Let's see if I can make that work. So I'm saying after I create it, make the third child the new div. This doesn't always work that well, but we'll see if it does work. No, it's not working right now. I don't think I can do this with children. I might have to grab the third one and then say something about it. Might have to say like inner HTML equals that. Let's try that. Still pretty weird. New div dot.
That doesn't it have to append it, and then it started like an array, like it starts getting bigger, and then you could just grab the third one then?
Yeah, yeah.
Or does it know already it's like a running array every time you add a new one?
Say that one more time. What's the question?
So like when you're clicking the button right now, before you started messing with it, it was parent div dot append, and then within it was the child.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it was like a running array, as every time you click the button, it would just add a new child, and then the length of that array per se would just keep growing.
Yes.
So couldn't you just keep appending it and then get the third one? Like if the length of parent div equals 3, then like what you're trying to do right now.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. I mean, I could have always, The idea is that this is sort of separate from appending. I'm just showing that if you really wanted to like say, well, I don't want to append, rather I want to get the third element that currently exists and replace it, there's a way to do that. That's all I was trying to show here. I'm not positive I follow what you're saying.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So
This is sort of this isn't necessarily the most important thing. The point is just to show you that given that you have the DOM, you have access to a lot of things. Appending is one of those things, but basically anything you could want to do, anywhere that you would want to add something or remove something in the DOM, there's a way to do that. It's just a matter of getting the right element, usually the parent element, and then some kind of you know, thing you can call on it, some method like dot this or dot that, which is going to get you that functionality you want. But ultimately, you're just manipulating this single object that represents the DOM. Can we use that dot class name to update an existing element class? Good question, Daniel. I'm not positive. You're saying that there's a, I just lost it, but no, so you're saying there's a dot class name. So you're saying that if I, what is the question, Daniel?
Yeah, so like, could you essentially append another class to an already existing element with already existing class attributes, or will that dot class name overwrite whatever's there? And
Well,
then,
I think the point is that it's JavaScript. So let's see, like, let's say I had only one div existing here, and let's say it had a class equal to alpha already, right? So I'm almost writing a different function here. We're not really inserting a new element, but we'll keep that button around. So let's say I have a class of alpha to start with, and that gives me green. And what's the other one we want to add? It's going to be called apple. And what that's going to do is have a font size of 20 pixels. So the idea is that if I look here right now, I just have alpha, it's green, I add apple, and now it's both green and bigger. But what if I just had alpha and I wanted to add apple to it, but not overwrite it? Is that the right question?
yeah, I didn't know if it was going to overwrite what was like overwrite alpha and replace it with apple, or if you can append apple to it.
Yeah, so what might we do? Well, first I want to grab this element with the class of alpha. So something I could write is document.get element by class name, but you'll notice, I mean, there's a couple ways I could do it here. I could do get elements by class name. And in that case, the class name was what? Alpha. But you'll notice that because it's get elements by class name, it's returning an HTML collection of, which means I would have to like grab, I would have to grab the first one off of it like this or something.
Well, you can just give it an ID for testing purposes if you want to make
I could, but let's just say I want it to be a class. Well, just as well, I would just say this is why query selector and query selector all are generally what you want, because this is just going to let me say, okay, just grab the first thing with alpha. And there's only one. Okay. But the idea is I'm going to grab it, and doesn't make sense to call it. I'll call it alpha div now, and if there wasn't one, we would simply return. But we're going to assume that there is one, and what we'll do first and foremost is just print it. So I'll write console.log alpha div, just to show that that is indeed the one that we are getting. So we're getting the thing with alpha, and then like before, I was able to write so what were we looking at before? We were looking at its class.
There's a dot class name.
So I see here we have allow for manipulation of elements class content attributes as a set of white space separated. So there's a couple ways to do this apparently, but if I look at class name, well, what is class name? If I were to print that out, what is there? So class name is just alpha right now. Well, that's just a string. So what if I said, okay, well, here's my class name. And my class name currently holds a string. Oops. But I don't want to overwrite it. I want to add to it. So basically we're just appending to a string. So my class name is currently alpha. And even though maybe it's a little ugly, I'm going to add a space. Otherwise it would just ruin things. And I'll name that new thing I'm adding on to it Apple. And now that I've done that, if I print this out, we'll see insert new div. It sees alpha apple and that thing actually did update. So that's how you would do that. And it looks like there's other things to make it even easier. So I saw there was class list. And what is a class list? It's a DOM token list. So let me just print that out just to see what that looks like. Okay, it's a DOM token list, and that list has one thing in it called alpha. So it sounds like if I say class list dot push, well, it's not quite that.
It's add.
Add. Okay, so yeah, there's some slightly different functionality, right? So I could say class list dot add, and then I want to add Apple to it. And this is probably the right way to do that. So I'm adding to it, and we don't even have to print it out. We'll see that when I click the button, it added that class. So yeah, there's always a slightly different API for all of these things, but generally it can be done if it's because the DOM ultimately, if we look at it, or maybe the better way to look at it, I'm just going to write document. If we look at this DOM, it's an object with all these things in it, and anything we could grab off of it would have certain properties. So if I were to look for this button, I could grab the button, and then this button is an object with all of these various properties on it, and they can be modified. So if it's sort of like if the DOM is represented by an object, it seems natural that because it's an object, you can add things to it, you can remove things from it, you can modify some values that it holds, and any change you make to the DOM will be instantly represented in the browser because the DOM is the source of truth for what the browser renders. Cool. Any more questions about what we've seen so far? I want to make sure we get to all of this, I guess. So what do we have here? Something we haven't explicitly talked about yet is events, and we want to do that. So as you see here in this index.html, I have this onClick, right? This onClick is a function that we call a handler, or we give it a function called a handler. And what kind of a handler is it? It's an event handler. So really when the click happens, an event happens in our code. And that event is the single argument to insert new elements. So in this case, I'm saying when an event happens, just immediately call insert new element. But in reality, it's more like this, as in this expects a function. That function by default takes an event. And then at this end, I can pass that event to this function of mine. So in here, I could write event. And then without even doing anything, I'm just going to inside say console.log event. And now what happens? If I click insert new div, we're not seeing anything right now. Did I save everything? I did. I would expect it to print something, even if it was just printing undefined. What's happening? Am I wrong about onClick?
I think actually, yeah, I think you just call the function
What do you mean? Like
without event inside.
Well, then the problem is, how does it know about its event?
Oh,
I might have to look this up, or this is going to be explained here. This could just be that on click is not that powerful. I'm used to React a little bit, which gives you a little more power there, but it's all still possible. So I'm going to grab this script here that we can then read through. And what does this script do? Well, it's still called insert new element. And when it's called, we're going to create a new div, and we're going to create this stuff on the div. I guess I'll take this out for now. And once we create this new div, we're going to add an event listener to this div. And that event is going to be for an event called mouse move. And the idea is that anytime the mouse moves over this event, it's going to trigger the event. And that's this body here, which says, so you'll see add event listener is a function and it takes 2 arguments. The first one being the type of event, which there are only, so many specific types. Mouse move is one of them. And then the second thing is a function. Second argument is a function, which takes an event. And what does it do? Well, in this case, it's going to first take the X ratio, and then this event represents the movement of the mouse, right? So it's going to take the mouse's X value and then do some math to figure out where it is in relation to the width of the page. And most of this is just math stuff that I'm not fully following, but at the end of the day, we're going to take that event, and where that event has a target, I'm assuming the target is going to be what the mouse is over. And we're going to set the background color of that target to some specific value. Okay. And then we're going to add an event listener mouse out, similar concept. And when we mouse out, we change the background color to whatever it started as. And then finally, we have our parent div. And if it exists, then we append the new child to it. So there's kind of a lot going on there. Right, but it does work. And we can kind of break down why it works by looking at this. So we have this new div we're creating. And if we didn't even have these event listeners, let's just get rid of them for a second. Without the event listeners, this is exactly what it was before, in that we're creating a new element and then we're adding it to we're adding it as a child to this parent div, right? And we can do that as many times as we want. And because it has alpha on it, and alpha is one of our styles, it's showing as green. So I'll make the second one apple, and then it will have both of those styles. Cool, so that works. But then if we look at each one of these, it's just a regular old div. And I wonder if there's a way to see all the events on it. But basically we don't have any particular events.
There's an event listener tab.
An event listener
Tab. If you.
Right. Oh, so that would be
The second row. Yeah. Event listener. Right there.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Event listeners. So it looks like we have no.
I don't actually know how it works, but
I've always been confused.
I just saw it.
But we'll see what happens if we add these events. So let's just add this one event here. See what happens. Now we're going to insert a div. And if it is working, but if I look at it, I'm going to look at this one right here, and I'm going to look at event listeners. I'm not seeing anything. Oh, no, I do. Yeah, mouse move. So it has an event listener called mouse move, and it's telling me a little bit about what happens when I hit mouse move. But basically, it has an event registered to it. So anytime a mouse move event happens, and that's handled by the browser, where if my mouse goes over it, it's going to color it red, right? So on a mouse move event, we don't need to worry too much about this math. I don't know why it's even necessary. Because it's gonna determine the nature of that red based on where I am, which is pretty cool that you can be that specific, that the red is going to change based on, it's going to be a deep red if I do it on the right, and not such a deep red if I do it on the left. Just to make this simpler, we can just take this stuff out and say, okay, well, on mouse move, we're going to take the event.target.style.background color and make it, not even going to write all this. I'll just write red, and it should understand that. Let's see if it still works. Yeah, that works. And it's not turning off, notably. But we just want to print console.log event to see what it looks like. So I'm going to add one of these. I scroll over it. You see there's so many, right? Every time that we mouse over this thing, it's creating a ton of events because that's how many times it's actually like recognizing that the mouse is over it. So that's the event itself. But if we dug into the event, we would find out it has a lot of stuff on it. And one of the important things all events have on them is something called a target. And that's like the element that trigger, or it gets a little confusing, but generally the same element that, or it's the element that the event is currently being run on, or the element that picked up the event. We'll get a little more into that because it's not always the same as the element that triggered the event, but in this case it is the same. So if I were to look at my source element, for example, the one that triggered the event was this, but at the same time, that's the target. That's what things apply to. And so we grab the target in order to change some things about it. And then over here, what we have is the second event, because mouse move and mouse out are different events. And we're saying that when it moves, we want to do that. Or actually, I wonder if this is going to autocomplete anything for me, but most people would not say mouse move, they would say mouse enter. There we go. So mouse move, like you saw, that triggers every time we move over it, whereas mouse enter will only trigger once when we move over it. And then mouse out will trigger once when we leave it. So if I were to print that, it would look like this. So basically I have my div, I scroll into it, we have a mouse event that I entered it and we changed something about it. And then I scroll out, that's another event, and we changed it back to what it originally was. So we will eventually see a more complex version of this with React, but this is the core of how the browser works, that you have these events, and the events are what let you click things, know about your mouse interacting with things. Like drag and drop is a pretty complex version of a event type thing. I don't think it's supported. Like you might think about how you might start to create drag and drop. Well, you need to know, okay, mouse entered, mouse clicked and held down, or that's probably two different events, mouse clicked followed by mouse held down. And then like you see how the behavior is going to be different when you first click, and then when it's already down and you're dragging, that's going to have different functionality. And then when you let go of it, you want something else to happen. And so things like drag and drop, like you see on like a website like Trello, not trivially easy to do with HTML. But the way you can do it, the reason why it's even supported is because of events, and click is an event. All these things are ultimately events. Okay, so that's add event listener. And as you saw, like when we had that thing before, even though we changed it, we could get certain things off of the event. So like if it was a mouse enter event, it's going to have an X and a Y that tells us the exact position of the mouse on the screen, and we might care about that. So like if I look in any one of these events, I can say, okay, it's a mouse event. What's on a mouse event? Well, among other things, there's an X and a Y, which represents that's exactly where my mouse was, I believe, absolute, from the top left of the page. Okay, so before going into more detail about events, how do we feel about just, this thing, add event listener?
Seems pretty straightforward.
All right, fair enough. I believe there's a way like we just added the event, but let's say I had another button, and in response to that, I might want to remove the functionality. I believe there is a way to do that. Remove event listener, exactly. So it's probably worth just seeing that, where I'm going to change this a little bit, where I'm going to say, okay, we have one button, and that is going to be add event, or event listeners on, And then we'll have another button called event listeners off. Just so you see that you can do this, or maybe I'll call this toggle event listeners. So maybe I'll do something like that, where the way this will work is that we'll just have some stuff in here already. What was that div again? We're just going to say, you know, hello world. And we don't really care about it having a class. We'll just leave it like that. And we'll have like 5 of these. Oops. Or rather, we'll just make 3 of them just so we can see that it works for multiple things. And what will happen is that, right, I initially have these things and I'm going to call this toggle event listeners. And I guess the way this will work is that I'll call toggle event listeners. And maybe we have an internal value. So, you know, this is going to be outside of the function, but maybe I have a value called let event listener status equals false for off. And maybe every time I toggle it, I'll say something like event listener status equals not event listener status. So that will just toggle it from true to false or false to true. And then maybe in here, we're not going to do anything with these divs right now, but rather I'm going to say, okay, well, first I want to grab this actual, I'll make a little status thing here. So I'll make a div with ID equal to status, and I'll initially put in false. How about that? Or off rather. So what does it look like right now? Toggle event listeners, it's off initially. And then I'm going to say, well, the first thing I want to do is get an element with an ID status. So I'll say document.get element by ID status. And then within there, I'll say, okay, given that status element, I want to grab the inner text. Oops, what happened there? Grab the inner text, and I'm going to make the inner text equal to, I'll say, if event listener status is true, then I'll say on. Otherwise, I'll say off. Oops. And first, let's just see that that's working, assuming none of this other stuff. Okay, so I can toggle that on and off, which is cool, but why do I even care? Well, what I want to say is that when it's toggled on, I'm going to go through all of these elements. I'm going to say, what were those elements I cared about? They were just regular divs that were the children of parent div. So I'll say maybe parent div, get element by ID, parent dash div, is that what it was called? Yep, and then I want to get all of its children. So now I'll say something like for const child of parented dot children. Not sure what the difference between node list of, okay. So I'm gonna go through this for each one of the children. And then from there, I could say child dot add event listener. And that's where I'll grab these two. So I'll say for each child in there, I want to add an event listener of this mouse enter and mouse out type thing, which is going to change the background color. And let's see if that works. See, it's off right now. And now that it's on, it does something. And now that it's off, it still does something. So why is that? It still does something because when we add an event listener, it's on there forever. So if I look at this and I look at event listeners, I see it has 2 event listeners. Cool. Well, let's say we didn't like that. What we could say is we have this event listener status that we're getting, which is going to be true or false. If it's true, I want to do this. Or I could say go through each one and then I'll say, if it's true that the event listener status is on, then I do these things. Otherwise, if it's not true, declaration or statement expected. Why is it confused? Because I did that. Yeah. So we're almost there, right? These two match up. And then I'll say if it's not true, then take that same child and delete both of those event listeners. So child.remove event listener. And what does that take? I think it just takes the name of it. So mouse enter. And similarly, right below it, we'll say we also don't want that mouse out functionality. And let's see how this works. So now I have everything off, right? Nothing happens. I click toggle event listener. Now something does happen. And if we look inside, we'll see it has the mouse enter, mouse out. And then if I toggle it off, well, if I toggle it off, it gets mad at me because it says fail to execute remove event listener on event target, 2 arguments required, but only 1 present. So why is it confused? It's expecting the first thing is that type. The second thing is the listener. Does anyone, why is this not working? What's a good example of remove event listener? So how might it work? Type, and then the next thing is listener, the event listener function of the event handler to remove. What? I have to keep track of the actual, I wonder what an example of this looks like. Ah, okay. So apparently that's what it wants me to do, which is interesting. It actually cares that for these 2 things, it wants me to write something like maybe out here, I would have something called const on mouse enter equals, why even wrap it in anything? And then that second one is what to do on mouse exit. And it's the same thing, except that we want to set it to initial. And then in this case, it just wants me to say when that event happens, I do this. And when this event happens, I do that. I want to get rid of these. And then when it's not the case, I do the same thing. So I guess I have to actually be explicit about which function it is I'm removing, because I guess I could have more than one function. I think that's why that I could theoretically have had more than one function associated with the same event. So let's see if this works now. Okay, so I toggle event listener on, it does something. I toggle it off, it's still doing it. Interesting. Okay, so I'm not sure why I'm not quite getting this. If anyone has tips, they could tell me, but I seem to be having trouble.
Try adding a 3rd argument false
To here? To remove?
to both of the removes, yeah.
Okay, what does this false represent? What is that argument?
I'm just looking at an example right now, and it looks like that it might work. I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, this is what we get for doing it in real time. It seems like that represents an options object. I don't know why false would help, but Okay, we do that, and then we do this, and it's still going. Honestly, I have no idea
Never
why
mind.
the remove event listener isn't working. But I can tell you that the main reason I'm not so familiar with it is because these are sort of these lower level tools that eventually you use abstractions on top of them. So in React, we never write like an on-click handler. Instead, we have a what they call a prop or a property called, on click or something, or on mouse enter. And then it's just a bit more natural of a way to do it. I am confused why my event listeners are not disappearing. Actually, I think I do know, actually, it's because I'm defining new versions of mouse enter and exit every time that function is run. What I actually want to do is have it out here. I think this will work now, because now they're going to be referring to the same function when it's on or off. Cool. Okay. So that was the answer. But yeah, pretty finicky. So it's not just you that will experience this sort of like, oh, right, you got to be precisely right type of thing. Okay, but what we haven't talked about yet that we want to bring up are certain special cases with the event. There's two of them that are pretty important. One of them being prevent default. So there's just like there's sort of default CSS for like an H1 or something like that. There's generally some default behavior when certain events happen. So a good example is submit. So if in my HTML, I made a little form, let's say. So I'm just going to make a form here. I don't really care about what this form is called, but I'll have a button on it. And I'll write submit. And this button will have a type equal to submit, I believe. And so what happens now if I click submit? You saw it kind of like reloaded the page, right? It was very quick, but it reloaded the page. And that's because when you hit submit, it's going to try and send to whatever the root, wherever you're getting that page from. It's going to try and, it thinks that's a server. So it's going to try and submit whatever was in that form to that server. So what we're actually going to do, and let me maybe put a little input here to say like input type equals text. And usually you would give it like an ID or some other, like a label equal to, is it label I want or name? I think it's name. I would give my input a name like, first name. So now I see that I have something here and I can hit submit, but it just reloads. So what I want to do here is not just have type submit, but I'm going to write on click, right? And then I'm going to write my on click handler, which I'm going to call on submit. Am I getting this right? I want to make sure that I get that event. Let me just look at these examples here. Okay, I see that we don't necessarily have an example. Oh, there's with submit. Okay. And the form itself has something on it called handle form submit. Got it. So rather this, instead of an on click, I want to say in the form, I have an on submit, and I'm going to make that equal to a function I'm going to write called on submit. And I believe I just have to write it like that, although I might be confused because I really want it to get the event. And so if I'm in here, delete all of this and I'll write, okay, well, I have const on submit, and it's a function, and we'll see if it takes something. But first, I just want to see, does this even work? Can I console.log try to submit? We'll see if it works. And we'll go to the console here, and I'm going to hit submit, and we're just reloading. So am I writing something to the console? Well, we're reloading immediately. Well, what I want to do actually is I need to have this event in here. And we'll see if this does work. I want to say event.prevent default. It doesn't seem to know about it. What's up with this? I'm noticing that in our example, we actually wrote handle form submit. Oops. and we gave it event. I didn't know that's how it worked. Maybe it is how it works. Maybe I actually have to write here event, and event is a special keyword it knows about. We'll see. I didn't know that it did work that way. But we can look it up. So I don't think this is going to work as expected, but if I say form on submit MDN, that's usually going to give me a good okay, so what might it look like? So right, this is exactly what I thought, that on submit could simply equal a given function. Maybe it can, it's just not doing great with auto completing, but this event inside is going to have certain features on it. And one of them should be prevent default. So like right here, we're taking that event and we're calling something called prevent default on it. So let me see if that works in my example here. I want to say event dot, oops. Maybe I'll print the event after, but the first thing I want to do is say event dot prevent default. And let's try this now. Still reloading. So honestly, I get there's other ways to do this, but I am finding this kind of rough. It seems like the best way maybe to do it with default HTML is to give it an ID equal to, you know, or not even an ID. I only have one form here. So I would say something in here like not even writing a function. I'm going to say const form equals document dot get element by tag name, which is going to be the form. And then on that form, I can say dot add event listener. Oh, sorry, I want get. I guess just get query selector. Okay, now that I have a form, I can say form dot add event listener. That event listener is going to be called on submit. And now I could probably more easily write my on submit functionality, which I'll call on submit. And then over here, I might write cons on submit equals, and that will know about taking an event. And then in there, I could say console.log event. And we have not solved anything yet. We're still doing that reload, but if it understands, I should be able to say event dot prevent default. Now, no, I'm still having the same behavior. Sorry, I'm a little embarrassed. This should be working. I'm not positive why, and I'm assuming there's no one, or Zainab's not here to maybe say why this isn't working. Does anyone have any ideas why this isn't working? I would imagine it would.
I see
I'm
the
actually curious.
HTML.
What are you trying to do with the event dot prevent?
Yeah, so basically certain default behavior, like when you hit submit, it's going to send something to the server and then reload the page. And the way you get around that is by saying the first thing you do is event.prevent default.
Also, it doesn't reload the page, it just sends information and the page stays the same.
Does your button have to be typed submit? I know it's got to be in the form to work. You got the word there, submit. Isn't it type in parentheses submit? It's got to be that the button's not connecting to the form element. You know what I mean?
That's
So
a
it's
good
not
point.
submitting to the form.
Even if we like, yeah, we would expect to see something. Well, I mean, I have my form here and my button is type submit. That's what I thought you did, but is it something else? I mean, this is elementary stuff. It shouldn't be
Sorry, I was looking at the one on the instruction.
right.
Why is the color? Is that color different on your submit text, or is that normal?
Meaning,
I'm trying to look for some semantic.
Let's see if we can get the answer really quickly, because the on submit is a big part of this. I'm surprised I'm not seeing it right away. But this does happen. Sometimes you gotta search for what you're looking for. So input type equals submit, right? And then that should line up with a so right, this would be a simple submit button. We're saying submit there, but where is the function that it's calling? I'm surprised this isn't in a more obvious place. Just form on submit. Okay, so we're going to call some function input type equals submit. This all looks right. Why? I would expect that. I mean, I'm just surprised. Yeah, I mean,
Can I look at the code?
sure, yeah. I mean, it seems to be implying that I should be able to write form on submit equals, or sorry, on submit equals to, and I should have a function here in index.js called on submit, and I expect that to take an event. And it seems like maybe the way you call that is like this. And in that case, I wouldn't need this event listener stuff. It would just be how this works. I don't think it is working, and I don't want to waste too much time on it.
I have no clue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Oh, there we go. Now it's working. Okay.
It
So
works now.
for whatever reason, it wasn't working before, but now it is, and we are getting that event in there. So note that if I didn't have this event.prevent default, I'm going to click submit. We saw it print something, but then it reloaded really quickly. And the way you get that to not happen is event.prevent default. And then that would let us do whatever we want, like, you know, be specific about where we want to send this info, or maybe grab some of that info because I'm printing out the event. But if I look in the event, I'm going to see target form. And within there was an input. Oops, I didn't want to target. Sorry, yeah, we have our submit event, and it has a target. And the first element of that target is this input. And we see there's nothing on it right now, but if I were to have typed something into it and then click submit, scroll all the way down, that created a new submit event. And inside the target, there is an input. And inside of that input is going to be that value somewhere, right? What is it called? Value? Or inside of that input, we should see a V. Is it not value? Node value. I mean, that whatever we just typed should exist somewhere on this input, right? It's definitely there. Does it have its own target? Is that?
I think it's just not showing you the whole list because there's a ... right after the O's.
So there's a ...
Yeah, go to the O's and that target.
It gets a little confusing, but right. If I had hello and then I click submit, because I'm just trying to show you that that event should have everything in that form. Target will represent the form. And if I click into it, I see form, I see input and button. I don't care about the button. I just care about that first input. And if I open it up, I want to see what's inside of it.
Yeah, keep going all the way down right there. You get down to like the O's, and then it gives you like a to be continued type of ... thing.
The O's?
Keep going, a little more.
A lot of O's.
See right there?
Oh, right. There's even more. Okay, so that's
Yes.
just to save space, right?
Yeah, so
it
maybe
should
that'll
have
get you to the
something-
bottom to value.
Value. There we go. Hello. So basically, if you filled out a
There you go.
form, that is one way you could do it, just by grabbing that event. Although you could always just use the DOM to say, okay, we'll get this specific input with this ID or this class or something. But right, that's how we would do that. That's how we would then, use that form data to, create something that we send to our backend or something like that. And the other one we haven't talked about is stop propagation. So to show how that works, is this the example for, I guess this is our example for stop propagation, that we're going to have something like this. So first I'm going to replace some of that HTML. And my HTML now has, this parent div with an on-click say hello, and then a div inside of it with an on-click say hi. And that's essentially it. And then if I look at my code here, I have these two things, say hi and say hello. And so let's see what happens when we run this. Okay, so based on what this says, if I hover over the parent div, it should do say hello. And if I hover over this internal one, this first element, first div, it should run say hi. So I'm going to hover over this third one. Nothing happening, nothing happening. Is anything happening, period? Wait, that's say hello and say hi. Okay, both of these look like they should work.
I think the event's on click.
Yeah, it's on click.
Could be what?
In the HTML, it's on click.
Oh, it's an on click. Good point. Yeah, sorry about that. I thought it would just be hover, right? So if I click here, what do we expect to happen? Third div. So this
Hello.
is the third div.
Nothing.
There's nothing on it, right? I
Hello.
click it, and then it said, I clicked it, and we got hello outer. So even though I clicked this thing with nothing on it, we still saw that its parent got that event. And what happens if I click this first one? We actually have both. We get the event that's on here, and then the event that's on its parent. So whenever we create an event, it's sort of like this element down here, this third one, we click it, it creates an event, and that event, a little easier to see maybe if I reload, it's going to create an event, and it's going to try essentially running the on-click that's on this div. And this div doesn't have an on-click, so nothing happens. But the nature of events is that they bubble. What we say that they bubble. So the idea is that this event, this click event happens here. There's no on-click handler here, so it continues. And it bubbles to the parent, which does have an on-click handler, and something happens, but it's actually not done. It'll bubble to the body, which doesn't have an on-click handler, and it'll bubble to the HTML, which doesn't have an on-click handler, and then it's done. And that's why when we click this one has its own on-click handler, so it runs, but after it runs, it's not done. That event keeps bubbling to its parent, to its parent's parent, etc. So the way you get around that is you say, okay, well, if I have a click event, in this case, say hi, I can say, well, if this one happens, I don't want any of the parents to find out that, we're throwing an event party. So what I can say is event, or what I'm calling EVT here, EVT dot stop propagation. It's a little harder with it not auto completing for me, but stop propagation means you get to run this on click, but it doesn't happen anymore. There's going to be no more bubbling. So now when I click this, when I click this, we still see hello outer because it doesn't have, this third one doesn't have its own on click, so it bubbles until it hits say hello. Whereas when I click the say hi one, we click it. Okay, it didn't quite like that. Did I spell propagation wrong or something?
Yeah, it's an A, not an O.
Okay, well, I mean, that's one of the problems with not having good autocomplete, but yeah, stop propagation. And so when I click the first div now, we see hi inner, but it doesn't bubble to its parent. So stop propagation, and I feel like that should be the default in my mind. I don't understand why. I kind of understand propagation. I understand prevent default behavior a little bit less, but basically prevent default behavior and stop propagation are both going to allow you more control over what the browser does in response to an event compared to what would happen if they weren't there. So like if they weren't there, you couldn't prevent that form from forcing a reload. If it wasn't there, things bubble automatically, and they give you a little more control over that. And that's we're getting pretty close to running out of time, which I'm surprised by. I thought we would have time to do a little more experimenting, but as you see here, this is that form I was talking about before, not too different. There's definitely some nice ways that you can say event.target, and that'll get you the form data, and then apparently browser JavaScript has a built-in, you can say new form data, and it's going to create an object from it, and then object.from entries, and you can get the key value pairs of all of your data, assuming they have, I'm assuming like a name. It'll have the name and the value. So right, we could just try this. I have this form now. I'll replace this with a form. Let's save and see what it's like, right? We have this name and this color, and note that they do both have IDs, but they also have names. And then we have our button, which I don't think that makes sense. I think you have to write type submit. And that should click off this on submit, which calls handle form submit, which takes an event. And here's the example of handle form submit, which let's grab all that. Okay, so what's going to happen? Well, when the form is submitted, I'm gonna put some stuff here, or might as well use real examples, Red and Ben. So now both these inputs have something in them, and then I'm going to click submit, and what I expect is that this will run. First, we prevent the default so it doesn't reload, and then we're going to get some kind of object that represents our the fields in our form by as key value pairs, and then this is looking through each one and saying, that's the field name and that's the data associated. So if I click submit, just going that far, we see name Ben and fave color red, which note they don't line up with those IDs. They line up with the name. And based on how we did this, I don't think we ever used those IDs. So we could just as well take those IDs out and nothing should change. That would just be how we would specifically get that element if we wanted it. Yeah, and so I'm doing Ben, I'm doing red, doing submit. We're seeing that print. And then at the end, we print this show greeting thing for the name. So you'll see that it's grabbing that name, and we're gonna, we have this greeting element in there, which we're getting by the ID. That's this output. And then we're putting something inside of there. So that's why we see something on the page. So, right, that's forms. And basically this probably seems like a pretty cumbersome way to change or basically it seems like pretty low level tools for working with a website, where the best you can do is just sort of add event listeners and then add things to the page or modify something on the page, and it works. But you can probably tell how if you were trying to make like a serious web app like Gmail, this would be very hard to accomplish with just these tools. And that's everything for today. What I was hoping we would have time to do is to see there's certain common like or types of websites or types of tools that are used as like a way to prove that your new web framework works. And one of them is to create a to-do list. So if we were to search like to-do list React, we would pretty quickly find a, various tutorials and other things to say, here's how to build a simple to-do list in React. And that might, we could look through it, but that it's sort of like, I would love to see a specific, Like if I said to-do list React GitHub, I wonder if there's a good like, okay, you could see it working type of thing. Because the idea is right. Basically, you want to create an app like this. Sorry, someone said something.
I was going to say I have a to-do list, but yeah.
It written in what?
It's not React, unfortunately, though.
Okay, but still, what is it? What is it?
It's just a to-do list. I can.
Sure, if you want to
Thought
share.
you were
your
looking for example. No, it's pretty ugly.
I mean, I. That's okay with me.
Okay.
I mean, and also the whole to-do list thing, it's a classic example, not really because you want to make it look nice, but because a to-do list is your like minimum viable product version of a website that is an app. As in, it's not just showing stuff on the screen. Okay, should I stop my sharing and you'll share yours?
No, I put the link, but
Oh, you put the link. Okay, so I'll share mine again.
it's like my third project. But yeah.
Okay, so I'm scrolling all the way down, and if we click this, right, we got a little to-do list here. Great. So I am. First of all, this is great. This does this if it has the functionality. This is great. So right, we can create a new task. So my task. We got that built-in calendar thing, which is great. Or maybe I don't know where you got that actually. And then I can add
It's built into HTML.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's good. So that's one of the inputs. I believe if we looked at this, we would see that. Let's try and make this look a little nicer. So there's some inputs, including this input here has type date. And so you kind of get that for free, which is cool. But yeah, if we're continuing to use this, I can delete things and they delete. And I'm just curious, how did you make this? Like, what is the source code?
I can give you the source code, but I just made it with vanilla JavaScript, like in 2021.
Okay, I see. So right, I am looking at your main JS, but people will notice it's very, very long, and the reason is because you used Webpack.
Oh yeah, I used Webpack.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little harder to read what you actually intended. We're not really looking at the source code. We're looking at like a version of the source code meant to be efficient and backwards compatible, but because you didn't write it yourself, it's ugly. But yeah, without being able to show how it works, or do you have like, did you do this by using like vanilla JavaScript and just
I have the source code and a GitHub, which is the second link.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to open that up now. And yeah, looking in here,
You look at the source file.
You look at your source file and look at your, I guess, index.js. And there's a fair amount going on here. But let's see where you start. Like, well, let's see first, where's your HTML? Like,
I think it's in dist.
All right. Okay. Yeah. If we look in dist, we'll see your HTML. And so, for example, like you have buttons. I guess you're setting it all. I guess you're not having any like on clicks here. You must be using event handlers.
Yeah.
And right, that main JS is coming from this source, I guess, which starts here. And at some point, I mean, I'm getting a little confused by your code, but at some
it's pretty bad.
But I don't even see where is it here, maybe display, like where are you actually making these changes? Either way, you could see how if you right, exactly. So like in this case, like we're trying to grab some specific element. I don't see where he's actually saying document dot anything, but there we go. Okay, document dot query selector all dot delete, which is a class. And so basically these are all the tools you need to make something impressive like a to-do list. But it could be a cumbersome way of doing things. And by the time we get to React, we'll see that there's a relatively nice way of doing things. Okay, I've used up most of your time. I do want to take a few minutes for questions if we have them, but otherwise we're gonna come back at 1:30 and work on the assignments for this. So
Ben, inner HTML versus inner text, what's the difference?
great question. So maybe we could show that pretty quickly. If I have index.html, I mean, it's going to be a very basic difference where I'm going to have a div, let's say, and we'll give that div an ID equal to content, right? Always messing that up. And then in that div, we will have, let's say, a paragraph with lorem ipsum, and with maybe we'll have that paragraph of lorem ipsum, and then below it I have another paragraph that looks like hello world, but then also that world, I want to make it bold. All right. So this is basically what we're working with right now. And then maybe I can just show it here. Like I have this whole thing, right? And so the first thing I'm going to do is say like content equals document dot query select, or not even query selector. I want to say get element by ID, and that ID is the word content, right? So we have our content here. Cool. And now if I say content dot inner HTML, what do we get? Well, we get everything that was inside of that HTML element, which is the paragraph, and basically it's the HTML. It's also going to include white space and stuff, but it's everything that was inside of that HTML element. And notice how that's that's giving you a string, whereas maybe if you cared about a specific thing, you might rather write, instead of content.innerHTML, we might write content.children, and that's going to give us a more object, an object version of what this represents. But then if I said context.innerText, what is that? Well, that's going to take the inner HTML and it's just going to strip it of everything that's a tag. So that's all the text that was in here, but notice that we just see hello world down here. We don't see hello, bold world. We just see hello world. So sometimes you care about just the text that's in there. Sometimes you care about all the HTML.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and you can think about it like, you might think inner text is kind of like, well, why would you care about just the text if, you're dealing with a website and you're trying to like modify what's inside of it? The main reason is that there's essentially two ways to use a website or read a website. One of them is to read it visually like this when you display it on a page. The other one would be like a web crawler. So Google visits lots of websites. It doesn't visually render them. It just looks at the HTML and gets information by looking at it. And so it might want to say like, okay, well, look for anything with like, let's say Google wants a very basic way of knowing what to essentially name the website when like looking at the results. So if I say, I go to google.com, not maps, rather just the main one, and I put something in there, it's actually showing me these little titles here, right? So how can it do that? Well, one very simple way is it could say, okay, look for the first H1 on the page, grab its inner text. I don't care if it bolds things or this or that. We just want the text that represents the header for this page. So basically web crawlers, right? Again, I'm cognizant about using up too much of your time, so it's already 11:05. If we have any other questions, we could take them, and I will stay. But if people want to start leaving and grabbing lunch, you can do that. If you have any other questions, you let me know. All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing for right now, but I'm still going to be around for a minute. Let me